Let's decode one of the most powerful shifts in literary and cultural studies, gender studies. Now, don't think of this as just a branch of feminism. Gender studies is an interdisciplinary field that brings together voices from feminism, queer theory, men's studies, psychoanalysis, linguistics, and more, all trying to answer one big question: what shapes our identity, and who decides what gender means? This field emerged strongly in Western academia after the 1990s, when the world was already opening up to ideas of deconstruction, post-structuralism, and performance. Thinkers began to challenge the old belief that gender is fixed. Instead, they argued, what if gender is something we perform rather than something we are? Enter Judith Butler, and yes, you'll want to remember this name. In Gender Trouble, she introduced the concept of gender performativity, asked several times in your exam, and it argues that there is no inherent male or female essence. Rather, our behaviors, how we speak, act, dress, create the illusion of stable gender identity. But gender studies doesn't begin or end with Butler. It's rooted in feminism, a movement that has long fought against the marginalization of women in patriarchal cultures. Feminist critics dig deep into literature, asking, whose voice is missing? Whose perspective is silenced? They examine how literature reflects, reinforces, or resists gender hierarchies, and they do this by looking at intersections of race, class, sexuality, and culture. Pause here and note these two important periodicals that publish feminist theory are Signs, a journal of women in culture and society, and Chrysalis, a magazine of women's culture. This was also asked in your exam. These platforms gave voice to generations of feminist scholars. Names like Virginia Woolf and Adrienne Rich echo through the early feminist canon, urging us to reimagine literary history through a woman's lens. Griselda Pollock extended this further by reading art and literature through a gendered perspective. Meanwhile, thinkers like Julia Kristeva and Bracha Ettinger used psychoanalytic theory, especially from Freud and Lacan, to understand how language, desire, and gender are interwoven. Kristeva's semiotic theory explored how the pre-linguistic emotional rhythms of meaning affect identity. It's abstract, yes, but incredibly useful in understanding how literature can shape and reflect gendered consciousness. Now here's a term that UGC often loves: womanism. Introduced by Alice Walker, this term gives space to Black women's experiences. It's not just feminism with a twist. It's a bold declaration of cultural survival, collective identity, and rootedness in community. Walker once said, "Womanism gives us a word of our own." Deborah Tannen, a linguist, coined the term genderlect, and this was asked in your exam a couple of years back. This refers to how men and women often speak differently, not just in content, but in rhythm, tone, and conversational patterns. Her research helps us understand the everyday performance of gender in language, where misunderstandings aren't just personal, they're cultural. So, whether it's feminist literary recovery, queer resistance, womanist affirmation, or psychoanalytic critique, gender studies invites us to question the foundations of identity, power, and authorship. It teaches us that gender isn't just about bodies, it's about language, space, culture, and the stories we tell. Let's decode a revolution not just in politics or society, but in the very way we read. Feminist literary criticism isn't just a lens, it's a mirror and a magnifying glass. A mirror that reflects how women have been portrayed, marginalized, or silenced in literature, and a magnifying glass that reveals the subtle ways patriarchy has shaped our literary canon. At its heart, feminist criticism asks powerful questions. How are women represented? Whose voice gets heard? And more importantly, who is missing from the story? This method of inquiry challenges gender stereotypes and exposes how literary texts often carry the invisible weight of cultural assumptions. Now pause here and note this down. Feminist literary criticism evolved in waves, and this is a classic UGC NET structure. The first wave, spanning from 1848 to 1920, focused mainly on political equality, especially women's suffrage and legal rights. Writers and critics of this era were fighting for the right to vote and be recognized under the law. The second wave, beginning in the 1960s, moved into cultural and literary territory. Feminist critics now asked not just, can women vote, but how are women written? This is where the real literary shift began. Think of it as literature meeting liberation. The third wave, rising in the 1990s, embraced diversity of voice, identity, and theory. It said feminism isn't one story, it's many stories. And the fourth wave, which we're living in today, brings digital activism and intersectionality to the forefront. Gender, race, class, sexuality, and technology all intersect to shape feminist reading practices. Let's go deeper. Within feminist criticism, there are various approaches: liberal feminism, radical feminism, and cultural feminism. Each offers its own method of reading and resistance. Here's the golden trick to remember. Elaine Showalter is a name you cannot afford to miss, asked in exam. She introduced the idea of gynocriticism, which is different from feminist critique. While feminist critique examines patriarchal structures, gynocriticism centers on women's literary tradition itself. In her seminal work, A Literature of Their Own, published in 1977, she called for a more imaginative, empathetic reading of women's voices in literature. Can you recall another foundational text? Yes, The Madwoman in the Attic, published in 1979 by Sandra Gilbert and Susan Gubar. This groundbreaking work examined how women writers like Charlotte Bronte or Emily Dickinson wrote under the shadow of male dominance, often creating characters who symbolized rage, resistance, or repression. Now, let's shift the lens a bit. As feminist theory matured, it embraced ideas from critical theory, especially from the Frankfurt School, along with psychoanalysis, both Freudian and Lacanian. Literature became a space where gender identity, unconscious desire, and symbolic roles could be explored, questioned, and rewritten. This is where French feminist theorists take center stage. Names like Julia Kristeva, Helene Sixus, Luz Irigaray, and Bracha L. Ettinger brought psychoanalysis and linguistic theory into feminist criticism. They explored the deep anxieties women experience in a culture that often positions them as other. Sixus's call for Écriture Féminine or feminine writing encouraged women to write from the body, from their lived experience, not borrowed forms. But here's something even more important: intersectionality. Feminism isn't complete without race, class, and cultural difference. This is where Black feminist scholars play a vital role. Think of Hazel Carby, Barbara Christian, Nellie McKay, Bell Hooks, and Hortense Spillers. Each of them pushed feminist literary theory to include the voices that had long been excluded. It was also asked in the exam. Can you see how wide this field stretches now? From suffrage to symbolism, from the unconscious to the digital, feminist literary criticism isn't a single path. It's a rich, multidimensional journey. And for UGC NET aspirants, mastering its key waves, terms, and thinkers is not just helpful, it's essential. In our next session, we will deep dive into the first wave feminism, where we will cover all the major authors, critics, and their major works, ideas, concepts, terms, and movements.